Coming up during a press conference today announcing that the federal government would no longer fund the state's Medicaid waiver. Governor Andrew Cuomo again accused the Trump administration of playing politics with New York. Pointed out all the different ways the green light law is hurting local and state governments, they say. Could this be the year that New York State passes gestational surrogacy? Well, Senator Liz Krueger and Assemblymember Dee Dee Barrett will be here in a few minutes to discuss the issue. And boy, Western New York Democrats love Bernie Sanders. Capitol Tonight starts now. It's Monday, February 24th. Welcome to Capitol Tonight. I'm Susan Arbetter. Governor Andrew Cuomo today announced that the Trump administration would no longer fund the state's Medicaid waiver. But more than that, he called the cancellation the latest in a continuing pattern of, quote, federal horribles the feds have visited upon the state, according to Cuomo. These include the cap on salt and unwillingness to provide approvals for a host of projects, including congestion pricing, and the ban on New Yorkers from the federal Trusted Traveler program.
There has to be a place where you don't play politics. It has to end somewhere. And it should end at health care. We all say health care is a human right.
Our Morgan McKay joins us now with more on this. Morgan, the governor is saying that the federal government is retaliating against New York. Is that the case?
Well, yes, Susan. Governor Andrew Cuomo is saying that this is just retaliation on the part of the federal government, and he points to examples such as a Trusted Traveler freeze and FEMA refusing to reimburse homeowners after flooding in the Mohawk Valley, saying the Trump administration is going after New York because it's a blue state. But the federal government has said for a while now that it was going to be starting rollbacks on this program and has started cracking down on multiple Medicaid supplemental programs, including in Texas. Their waivers also phasing out, and Texas is a red state that Trump won in 2016.
So, Morgan, why does the state need this waiver? Why is it important to the state?
So when Cuomo came into office in 2011, the state was facing a massive budget deficit, $10 billion. And Medicaid was expected to grow by $6 billion that year alone. So Cuomo launched a Medicaid redesign team, and they came back with a proposal for this federal waiver. The state received $8 billion from this grant, and this was spread out over the past 5 years. So the state was relying on this money. Again, and with the state already in a Medicaid deficit, this is definitely piling on costs, especially to hospitals, which were the direct recipients of this money.
Morgan McKay reporting for us. Thank you so much. Republican state lawmakers, meanwhile, met with federal officials from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to discuss their concerns with the green light law again. Green light allows undocumented immigrants to apply for driver's licenses. ICE and other federal officials have blamed New York for blocking immigration enforcement officials from accessing the state's motor vehicle database. Congressman Tom Reed helped broker the meeting, and he says it's time to change the law.
These are qualified law enforcement officers who have spent decades in these positions. And what they learned is the lesson of 9/11. You know, 9/11 should never be forgotten, especially in the state of New York. And we're going back to pre-9/11 mindsets of a fragmented law enforcement, federal, state sharing mindset where you don't share that information.
Nick Reisman is joining us tonight from the State Capitol Bureau. So, Nick, what did Republican lawmakers learn from their briefing today?
Well, one thing that Republican lawmakers, including Congressman Reed, as well as Senate Minority Leader John Flanagan, as well as the Assembly Minority Leader Will Barclay, all wanted to get across that this is really a security issue. They're trying to move away from what Governor Cuomo has claimed throughout all of this, and that is a concern about the federal government targeting undocumented immigrants. What you just heard from Congressman Reed, as well as what we have heard throughout this entire process from Republicans at all levels of government, is that this is really a security concern, that federal border agents, as well as the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, need access to that motor vehicle database in order to be able to do their jobs.
So the governor has heard those claims as well. What has he been maintaining throughout this discussion?
Well, he sees a through line here. You had that discussion earlier about the Medicaid waiver, but he is seeing a complete through line. He's connecting the dots, he says, on what he sees as federal interference in all of this. He thinks that the Trump administration is essentially trying to punish New York for being a democratic state for enacting policies like allowing undocumented immigrants to have driver's licenses. It's worth really taking a step back here, Susan, and thinking about this for the first time, that this has really always been kind of the third rail of New York politics, allowing undocumented immigrants to have these driver's licenses, and it's something that is now kind of getting into the national sphere and national conversation.
So I said this on Friday, Nick, but it seems as if the governor is negotiating in the press at this point. Would you agree?
Right. I think that's pretty much where we are at this point. It doesn't seem like Governor Cuomo and President Trump have been meeting or talking on the phone since his White House meeting. And the governor, over the last several days, has been throwing out these various proposed compromises, such as offering the entire motor vehicle database, but expunging the Social Security numbers from that database in order to make it harder for federal officials to determine whether a person is an undocumented immigrant or not. So far, it does not seem that any parts of the federal government, including the Department of Homeland Security, is willing to bite on any of these proposed compromises.
Nick Reisman, thank you again. Not even an appearance by Andy Cohen of Bravo TV was enough to make sure that gestational surrogacy was pushed over the finish line last year. And the reality TV impresario is back again this year to support surrogacy, a bill carried by Senator Brad Hoylman. But critics who had issues with the surrogacy bill last year still have issues with it this year. So Senator Liz Krueger and Assemblymember Dee Dee Barrett have introduced an alternative bill that would legalize and regulate both gestational and genetic surrogacy, as well as provide appropriate protections for all parties, including the surrogate. And both Senator Krueger and Assemblymember Barrett join me in the studio tonight. It is great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is again another point, another example of an issue, technology and science getting way ahead of the law. How did you get interested in this?
So last year, my colleague Brad Hoylman moved a bill, and I told him from the beginning that I had concerns with the bill. And he, in fairness, worked with me, made many amendments to his own legislation. But I knew that by the time we were finishing session, and he brought the bill to the floor, that it was still not a bill I could be comfortable with. And I stood on the floor of the Senate and I explained why I respected him. I knew and adored his two beautiful children, who he has through surrogacy with his husband, but that didn't change the fact that I didn't believe his bill built in enough safety protections for all the people we need to make sure we have a healthy and smart system for, and that's the egg donors as well as the surrogate moms who carry for 9 months, as well as the child and children who are born, that we didn't have enough protections built in. And that New York was like the majority of states in this country in that we don't have the laws in place, and we needed to do it right, not a fast swing by with celebrities and slide it in the budget and no one take any harder look at it.
So you've created a framework, really, for regulating this issue.
Yes, and it's artificial reproduction. So it's people don't understand how risky the egg donation process can be to young women who get caught into a cycle where they get paid to allow their bodies to be harvested of 30 and 40 eggs at a time, being shot up with large amounts of hormones. You talk to them afterwards and you learn if they have a cancer history in their family. They may have triggered cancer at a very young age. They may end up losing their own fertility because they've gone through this process. I'm not saying people shouldn't choose to be egg donors to assist others who need their help. I'm saying you need to be educated about what the risks are. There need to be standards in place about how many times you're going to do this.
There are a lot of protections in your bill that are not in the Hoylman bill. I wanted to bring in Assemblymember Dee Dee Barrett. Why is this important to you?
Well, when I first heard about the Hoylman-Paulin bill, and in the Assembly it was carried by Amy Paulin, it just struck me as a lifetime advocate for women and girls that this wasn't the whole story, that there were three players in it, particularly that bill, because it only addresses gestational. It doesn't address genetic surrogacy.
And these are two different things, genetic versus gestational
genetic
surrogacy.
means that the surrogate is also the egg donor, and gestational has three different parties: the egg donor, the surrogate, and then the future parents. And so I felt that very much I needed to understand more, and I needed to really get where all the parties were and the protections that were in place there. And it was pretty clear, because even in the people that we spoke to over the course of the summer as I continued to do research, and nobody was talking about the egg donor.
I want to ask about a couple of protections that are in this bill. One difference between your bill and the senators is that 8 days after giving birth, the surrogate has the surrogate has 8 days between birth and the time she needs to acknowledge the parental jurisdiction.
Well, she has 8 days after birth to sign off removing any parental rights for herself. During the pregnancy, she is signing a document going into an agreement with the surrogate, and upon the birth of the child, there would be a legal status for 8 days. So the intended parents would be taking that baby home from the hospital, assuming it was well enough to come home from the hospital, and it would be—
I was going to say, who takes home the baby?
The intended parents.
Okay.
But you give the birth surrogate mother the opportunity to just catch her breath. If she had a C-section, which is statistically much more likely in surrogacy, you want to make sure that she's got all of the anesthesia cleared out of her system and is thinking clearly.
Okay.
But most of the world does not have a system where you've transferred your parental rights before birth. And we're building so many protections and standards into the bill about who would be a surrogate, what they need to know, what they need to agree, that I actually think the likelihood of somebody changing their mind post-birth is statistically a fraction of cases.
And can I just say the most important thing here is that we are opening a conversation that's much broader than the one that the prior bill
Yes,
offered.
I can see that.
And it's not a bill that should go through into a budget process. There aren't.
Are you speaking with Hoylman? Is he negotiating with you on this?
I spoke with Senator Hoylman just today. I'm confident that he also thinks moving it through the budget rapidly is not the right way to go, even though we do not agree on everything in our bills.
Senator Krueger, Assemblymember Barrett, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having us.
Still to come on Capitol tonight, Bernie Sanders has plenty of support in Western New York. We're going to tell you why Democrats in Erie County are celebrating. Plus, we're going to take a look at the latest poll numbers on the presidential race. Stay with us. Today's Siena poll indicates that the mood of New York State Democrats is 100% gloomy. Pollster Steve Greenberg joins me now with the details. 67% of people polled said they think that Trump will win.
62%, so not quite 2/3, but pretty darn—
Who's quibbling over 5%?
Exactly, 62% versus 29% who think he will not win re-election. Not surprisingly, 80% of Republicans, but nearly 3/4 of independents and even Democrats, a plurality, 48 to 41% Democrats think Donald Trump right now is headed to re-election.
All right, why don't we break down where the individual Democratic candidates are?
Sure. If we're looking at the primary, which is still 9 weeks away in New York, and is likely, the field is likely to change certainly after next Tuesday's Super Tuesday, but right now 25% of Democrats, and these are Democrats, not likely primary voting Democrats.
And I think we do have a graphic for this.
So 25% are with Sanders, 21% with Bloomberg, and down in double digits for Biden and Warren, and Klobuchar and Buttigieg are in single digits. But what we see really is young people, upstaters, downstate suburbanites, they're with Bernie. Older voters, New York City voters, they're with Bloomberg.
Yeah, that's very interesting that he was the mayor of New York City and New York City people like him.
Absolutely. He is tied for the lead with African American voters right now in New York, tied with Joe Biden. Bernie, a distant third with black voters right now. So, you know, Democrats are a little bit over the map because, I mean, you have the two, Bloomberg and Sanders, at the top of the heap, but you still have a lot of support for those other four candidates. The leader only has 25%. But when we ask voters, who's likely to win among them? What Democrats say, 33% say Bloomberg, 22% say Sanders, everybody else in the distance.
So it's not necessarily that voters may like Bloomberg or Sanders, but they think that he will win. And these are ABT voters, anybody but Trump.
Well, yes and no, because the other question that we asked Democrats was, are you looking more for a candidate who you agree with more on the issues or one who can beat Trump? 51% of Democrats, a small majority, said they're looking for a candidate who agrees with them on the issues, compared to 45% of Democrats who say they're looking for anyone but Trump, or the candidate who can best beat Trump.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to put on your political science hat for a minute there, Steve.
It is where my degree is.
It is where your degree is. So what happened to Biden?
Well, you know, it is not unusual for frontrunners in these long marathon-like campaigns, early frontrunners to fade. But let's also remember, this is Joe Biden's third time running for president. Do we remember how well he did those first two? We've never had President Biden. In fact, Joe Biden in 3 campaigns has yet to win a single primary or caucus. So he's never been a great candidate. And right now, Democrats are sort of leaving him.
So,
we'll see what happens in South Carolina on Saturday. It'll be fascinating.
Yeah, it absolutely will. And again, New York's primary, April 28th.
9 weeks.
A little earlier than usual.
Yeah, but you know what? We're doing it with some of our neighboring states that same day. Looking at the field as it is right now, early on I thought New York might not be in play. Now I'm starting to think New York may very well be in play by the time we vote.
Siena College's Steve Greenberg, thank you.
Thank you.
More good news for Bernie Sanders. The group WNY for Bernie says support is strong in Erie County. The organization analyzed federal campaign contributions this cycle and found Sanders significantly outpacing his primary opponents in both the total amount of money raised and in the number of individual donors. University at Buffalo Associate Professor of Political Science Jacob Nyheisel says that Sanders has emerged as an early frontrunner, but he doesn't read too much into the contribution numbers.
Donations suggest that there is some excitement surrounding the candidacy, and I'm generally cautious about reading a ton into those kinds of figures. You know, people who are supporting the candidate want to throw some money behind it. I don't know that that's a measure necessarily of viability going forward, or just a measure of how much he's exciting the base.
Western New York political reporter Ryan Whalen spoke with Nyheisel today and joins us now with more analysis. Ryan, you went through the numbers yourself. What did you find?
Yeah, well, I found, unsurprisingly, it's very difficult to get through federal campaign contribution documents. Literally, you have to put in every individual zip code in Erie County to get the contributions. But what I found is cross-checking it with what Western New York for Bernie did, that it's pretty consistent, that it goes Bernie Sanders with a pretty significant contribution lead and an individual contributors. Then it goes to Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, and Amy Klobuchar trailing far behind.
So how does this compare to 2016?
Well, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was running away with the campaign contribution lead in Erie County. Unsurprisingly, a home state senator. They call Erie County Clinton country. And Bernie Sanders was a relatively kind of new candidate specifically in this area. And as Nyheisel said, he had a brand of politics that maybe the party was still catching up with.
Sure.
So him having a lead this year, it's way different than 4 years ago.
So Ryan, why does Erie County matter? I mean, in a broader sense, why do these numbers matter?
Yeah, I think you look at Erie County in terms of New York State and the country, and it can be sort of a bellwether. When you're talking about sort of more conservative Democratic districts, Erie County has typically been that. So when you look at someone like Bernie Sanders, who people typically look at as the far left side of the party, doing so well in this area, and in that Siena poll that you talked about earlier, 35% in upstate, it may not be as moderate as people used to think.
Interesting. Ryan Whalen reporting for us from Buffalo. Ryan, thank you again. New York GOP Chairman Nick Langworthy filed paperwork to get President Trump's name on the New York ballot today. After meeting with the president last week, Langworthy says the president is paying close attention to New York. According to Langworthy, the president can be successful in this very blue state.
You know, we're pretty dark blue, but in the places where we're running competitive races around the state for Congress, for state Senate, for state assembly, those are all areas where President Trump performed extremely well in 2016, and he's going to do it again in 2020.
Coming up, the cost of prescription drugs just keeps getting higher, but lawmakers are considering a bill that would shed some light on what some consider a shady pricing system. Stay tuned. So think about all the prescriptions you have to buy every month. Those costs can really add up, right? Well, what you might not know is that some of the costs of those drugs are artificially inflated thanks to deals that name brand pharmaceutical manufacturers cut with the makers of generic drugs. These companies actually pay the makers of generics to delay the introduction of cheaper drugs. But a new bill in Albany will ensure that these pay-for-delay agreements are no longer kept a secret. Joining me to explain is Bill Ferris. He's the legislative representative of AARP New York. Great to see you.
Thank you, Susan.
So tell us what this bill would do.
So basically what this bill will do is anytime a drug manufacturer, brand name drug, enters into any type of agreement with a generic company, they will have to disclose to the New York State Attorney General what that arrangement is and what drug they're delaying, what generic drug they're delaying to the marketplace, how much that drug is, and what disease it treats.
Will the AG then basically tell us, tell consumers, because it doesn't matter unless we know?
Absolutely. The bill, and it's being sponsored by Senator Biaggi in the New York State Senate, Assemblyman Den Decker, and it essentially has the AG disclose this information on a website, also have that information reported to the Department of Health.
Great, transparency. So the governor is also introducing three-part legislation on RX issues. What is he doing?
So the governor wants to have drugs imported from Canada. He wants to bring all the stakeholders into a room, develop a plan. The federal government requires a plan from a state if they want to import drugs from a different country, in our case, most likely Canada. So we're very happy the governor is proposing that. He's also proposing a $100 cap on insulin, which is a very good idea to us. We're going to take a look at that. Senator Rivera has a bill on insulin. AARP is going to take a look at that. Also, the governor wants to do an RX price control board to really look at the cost of prescription drugs. And I think you said that earlier. Everything in this market, everything in this area is all about the cost of the drug.
Yeah.
And the governor wants to have a RX price control board that now the legislature is looking at, which was proposed in the governor's executive budget.
So it's really critical to curb these costs, especially among older New Yorkers. What's going on there?
Well, we think we have an RX affordability problem in the state of New York. And if I may, we have some stats that show that the annual cost of prescription drug treatment increased 57% between 2012 and 2017, while the annual income of New Yorkers only increased 11%. We actually did a survey recently.
Yeah, that's big.
It is big. If your drugs are going this way and your income's going here, there's a major gap that people have to fill, and it's an out-of-pocket cost to try to fill this gap. We did a recent survey that showed 24% of New Yorkers 50 and older actually did not fill a prescription in the last 2 years. 24% of people 50 and older in the state did not fill a prescription in the last 2 years.
Simply because they don't have enough money to do it.
60% of those people said they didn't fill their drug because of cost.
Wow.
To us, to AARP, that is a major problem. We're happy that the governor is trying to address this, and we hope the legislature will join the governor in negotiations and really get something done this budget.
Question. Just today, the governor held a press conference to announce that the federal government said canceled a Medicaid waiver, and it will cost us about $600 million. He also connected the dots for us. He seems to believe that the Trump administration has it out for New Yorkers because of SALT, because of Trusted Traveler. The governor's going to need to ask the federal government for permission to approve a plan to import drugs from Canada. Are you sure then that the feds will do that?
Well, we're fairly confident that if New York State submits a plan to the Health and Human Service Secretary in Washington, in the Trump administration, they will most likely approve that plan if it meets the standards that already exist in federal law. The President of the United States has already told the state of Florida when they went through this last year that he's supportive of the Florida plan to import drugs. His own agency is put guidelines out.
So there's already precedent.
There's already precedent that the governor is, or the President of the United States, on record to support this.
AARP's legislative representative for New York State, Bill Ferris, thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
That's all for us. Have a great night. On Long Island who may be guilty of housing discrimination. Our Nick Reisman will explain why this is an issue for us here in upstate New York. On the green light law, it appears that Governor Cuomo is negotiating in the press. He issued a statement just before 5 p.m. saying that he's exploring whether to remove Social Security numbers from the DMV database. We'll explain what that means. We will meet some Western New York delegates for Pete Buttigieg, and we'll eat a pizza to explain New York's wealth gap and because it's good. Capital Tonight starts now. It's Friday, February 21st. I'm Susan Arbetter. Welcome to Capital Tonight. The New York State Senate took the rare step of issuing 25 subpoenas to realtors on Long Island today. The reason? These individuals failed to show up at a hearing on housing discrimination held back in December. That initial hearing was prompted by an award-winning series published by Newsday called Long Island Divided, for which the newspaper hired pairs of testers to see if real estate agents would steer them to particular communities, and they did. Of Long Island's 291 communities, most of its black residents live in only 11. But housing discrimination is not just a Long Island problem. The dirty little secret is that in communities across New York State, in Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, people of color and people who use Section 8 housing vouchers are discriminated against every day. Alice Green is the director of the Center for Law and Justice in Albany, and she says the problem is a pervasive one across New York.
We still have a great deal of segregation, and a lot of it comes because of discrimination in house buying. And real estate agents still do the things that they did before the 60s, before the civil rights movement.
I'm joined now by reporter Nick Reisman to discuss the unusual step taken by the state Senate to issue subpoenas. Nick, why would the Senate do such a thing?
Well, quite frankly, Susan, and it is indeed an unusual step because the state Senate and the state Assembly rarely, if ever, issue and exercise their subpoena power. You'd have to go back to at least 2012 when Senator Jeff Klein did it for a not as serious issue on the issue of Four Loko and trying to compel witness testimony at a public hearing. And that is essentially what the state Senate Democrats are trying to do right now. They're trying to get entities and real estate entities, realtors, to come to their public hearing in April to answer questions based on this Newsday story. They had a hearing back in December of last year to try to get answers and try to follow up on what happened with all of the housing discrimination that Newsday found in their explosive series. But ultimately, those people did not wind up testifying at that hearing. So now they're taking this step to compel that testimony and get answers.
So can you give us an example, Nick, of what housing discrimination looks like?
Well, one thing that Dr. Green was talking about in my interview with her was there are often cases where realtors will be showing homes to prospective home buyers of color, and they will only show them in certain communities, in certain neighborhoods within towns and cities. And that has kind of created this situation where you can see it across upstate New York. You can see it in downstate New York as well, where there are communities that are clearly divided, where there is a white side of town and then there is a black side of town.
Absolutely.
Or a Latino side of town.
I thought that this kind of thing, though, was illegal thanks to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Are we talking about that sort of blatant discrimination, or what happened on Long Island?
Well, certainly there are forms of discrimination that are illegal, but yet they still continue. You see that across the board, not just in housing, but also in transportation. You see it in the workplace as well. And that is partially why I think the Senate Democrats want to have these answers, and they could even broaden this investigation as well to include upstate communities, to include the Hudson Valley and Western and Central New York as well, because ultimately what they are really looking at here is kind of this pervasive but also kind of quiet form of discrimination that we're seeing in real estate and in the home buying industry.
Absolutely. So, you know, you go to, let's say, downtown Rochester versus like Victor, or downtown Syracuse versus Manlius, downtown Albany versus Bethlehem. You know, a lot of this has to do with schools and, of course, the changing nature of cities.
A lot of it has to do with money, too. There
Yeah.
is this concern that is racially driven in large part with the idea that if you have a black family move into a community, somehow that is going to devalue everybody else's home property values at the same time. So that is a concern that has been raised repeatedly in this investigation with Newsday, and something the Democrats in the state Senate are looking at as well.
So the hearing for the subpoenaed testimony is scheduled for April 17th. Can you give us a sense of what we can expect?
I would imagine lawmakers in the state Senate are going to be asking some pretty pointed and direct questions. We did get a statement from State Senator James Skoufis, who is actually the chairman of the Senate Investigations Committee, and he is really concerned about why these realtors and other organizations did not show up for that December hearing. So I got to imagine that the questions are going to be pretty pointed and direct.
Nick Reisman reporting for us from the state capitol. Thank you again, Nick. According to multiple reports, President Trump has kept up his attacks on federal law enforcement agencies despite pleas from Attorney General William Barr and the resignation of longtime Justice Department prosecutors. The president has suggested that Barr, quote, clean shop, and has promoted the idea of naming a special counsel to investigate both DOJ and the FBI. To explain just how unusual this is and the kind of long-term effect it could have on the Justice Department, we invited Michael Koenig to join us. Koenig is a partner at the firm of Hinckley & Allen. He is also a former federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and it's wonderful to see you.
It's great to see you too, Susan.
So what are your thoughts on this kind of meddling, interference, whatever you want to call it?
Well, as someone who's been at the Justice Department, I'm very troubled by it, I'm very disheartened by it, and quite frankly, I'm disgusted by it. This is not the normal course of things, the way the Department of Justice should work. The Department of Justice is an independent arm. And while, yes, the Attorney General serves the pleasure of the President, there's always been lines of demarcation about where the politics ends and the law starts. And it's a fine line sometimes, admittedly so. And the president has the right to direct policy, such as we're going to focus on civil rights, for example, or we're going to focus on narcotics, or we're going to focus on corporate fraud or antitrust, a whole variety of things. But it's never been the case where the Attorney General is a political operative of the president, or where the Department of Justice is a political arm of the White House. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the Attorney General act essentially as the president's political hitman, and that cannot happen in a rule of law society that we have been principled upon since the beginning of the Republic.
So let me explain to our viewers what has happened. Now, the president publicly condemned the case against Roger Stone, who was convicted just yesterday of witness tampering.
Who was a friend of his also, let's be honest.
Who was a friend of his.
He criticized the case. He criticized the case going against a friend of his.
Right. He called it horrible and very unfair. A.G. Barr, the Attorney General, then intervened to lower Stone's sentencing recommendation, which would have been seen as a compromise. Excuse me, would have compromised the Justice Department, yes?
Yes, he went against what his line prosecutors and the supervisors in the U.S. Attorney's Office had recommended.
So was there anything unusual about the prosecution of Roger Stone? I mean, did the president have any reason to weigh in there?
The presidents should not weigh in on the enforcement of the law. And presidents historically, if you look back, have never weighed in on the specifics of a case. Even
never.
Say never to say never. I mean, I've not looked at every single decision.
But
very often, if you go back historically and look, Susan, at Obama and Clinton and Reagan and Bush in the most recent past, they very rarely will specifically ever get involved in a particular case unless perhaps the president ultimately issues a pardon. At that point in time down the road, then a president is injecting himself into the criminal justice system. But at a trial level, you never see it happening. And the way the Department of Justice works is you've got the political appointees, the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, the leadership. But the Department of Justice is men and women throughout this country, 93 U.S. attorneys' offices who on a day-by-day basis go in to represent the government, the United States.
Regardless of who's president.
Regardless of who's president. You have lifers who are there forever. You have people like me who were there for several years. I wasn't a political appointee. I litigated my cases. I investigated and prosecuted my cases. And I will tell you this, in the time I was there, Susan, and I did corporate fraud across the country, never once, ever, did my section chief or a supervisor or the head of the criminal division or the deputy attorney general ever suggest to me a particular course of action.
So we have about a minute and a half. I have two more questions. First of all, what do your contacts at DOJ say about this?
They're repulsed by it. They are nauseated by it. It is not the Justice Department that they or I or all my friends went to work for.
Is William Barr the good guy here or not?
No, it is not his job to be complicit. He should know that the Attorney General does not serve the political aspirations and the political goals of the President of the United States.
The most important question is, what will be the long-term impact on the Justice Department? I mean, could this really hurt the department's integrity?
I think the department's going to lose. Integrity is one word, but also credibility. Judges give assistant United States attorneys, federal prosecutors, the benefit of the doubt because of their credibility in representing the ideals of the Justice Department. And when those ideals have been so severely undercut as they are right now, it is going to affect each and every good, hardworking young man and woman who serves as an AUSA when they go into court.
Can it be, can they rebound from this?
You know, our institutions are strong, Susan. Our country was predicated upon strong institutions. I think the Justice Department is bearing a weight right now like it never has before, but I do believe ultimately in the institution, and I think at the end of the day, if the right people come back to lead the Justice Department will survive.
Michael Koenig is a partner at Hinckley Allen, a former federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice. Thank you.
My pleasure, Susan. Great seeing you. I love your new digs.
Thanks. Governor Andrew Cuomo is slightly tweaking his position when it comes to the ongoing freeze surrounding access to the Trusted Traveler program for New Yorkers. In a statement released about 2 hours ago, Cuomo raised the possibility of removing Social Security numbers entirely from the DMV database so federal immigration officials can't target undocumented immigrants in New York. Any change like that would likely have to be approved by state lawmakers. Now, Cuomo previously told President Trump he would be willing to offer DMV records on a case-by-case basis to those applying for the Trusted Traveler program. Yesterday, the acting director of ICE described the provision in the Green Light Law preventing New York from sharing DMV records with federal officials as dangerous. Still to come, there are 22 people who will be responsible for mapping out how New York will cut carbon emissions. And coming up, we're going to meet one member of the Climate Action Council. Stay with us. The 22-member Climate Action Council is the group of experts recently appointed by the governor and the legislature to map out exactly how New York State will implement the new emissions reduction law passed last year. Now, last month, we spoke with Peter Iwanowitz of Environmental Advocates, who was appointed by Speaker Carl Heastie to this council. Today, we welcome Gavin Donahue. He's the president and chief executive officer of the Independent Power Producers of New York, and he was appointed by Senate Minority Leader John Flanagan. It's great to see you.
Good to see you, Susan. Thank
All
you.
right, so first of all, IPNY, what is it? Who do you represent?
I represent 3/4 of all the electricity generated in New York State. We represent nuclear plants, gas plants, wind farms, solar farms, hydro facilities.
So for anybody who's trying to paint you as the gas guy, you say...
Not true. The chairman of my association is Brookfield, who's the biggest hydro developer in New York State. I represent 60% of all the renewable capacity today that's being generated in New York State. And we have carbon-free electricity across New York State. 89% of our electricity today in New York State is carbon-free upstate due to the emissions-free nuclear power plants that we have in upstate. So we're not just a fossil fuel organization.
So about 14 months ago, I did a piece on the climate bill. It was a climate bill, not the climate law at the time. Yeah. And we talked, and you said one of the things you were really concerned about is how we were going to get from here to there, the nitty-gritty of moving us from carbon to off carbon. And now you're one of the people in charge of the nitty-gritty. So how do you feel about that?
It's a daunting task. It's exciting. We are talking about transforming our economy in New York State, electrifying every aspect of our lives. It is going to be a daunting task. I don't think 14 months later I'm any closer to the details. Our first meeting is March 3rd. I'm looking forward to getting around the table and talking to other experts about how to do this. But there's certain things that need to happen to make it happen. And I'm going to push to make sure that the facts and the details are out there so we can make wise policy decisions.
What is your priority on this panel?
Well, first of all, the priority is to listen to some of the true experts that run the grid, like the New York ISO, the Public Service Commission, the Reliability Council. One of the things we cannot fool with, jeopardize, is reliability. And second of all, we want to make sure it's cost effective for ratepayers. And then we want to make sure it's as clean as possible. So to get the details through an economic technical analysis about how to achieve these emissions is critically important before we make decisions.
All right, so reliability, predictability, these are all important. So what that suggests to me is two things: transmission issues and natural gas. There are a lot of people who have been appointed to this panel who want to say goodbye to natural gas. You are not one of them. Why?
No, because if you were going to rely on intermittent renewable resources, which the law requires, if you don't have wind and you don't have the sun, you're not going to have electricity. So you need natural gas to back the system up at some point. I'm proud of the fact that New York State today is coal-free. We have no coal plants in New York State. Natural gas is 50% cleaner today than the natural gas of 20 years ago. It's 50% cleaner than coal. So it is a fuel that we need to transition if we have a chance to meet these goals. And for folks to say we're not going to need natural gas is not being honest about our future as a state and economic development policy and reliable electricity.
So you see this as a transition fuel?
I do. I think it's a fuel that has to be part of our electricity if we're going to have a reliable electricity system.
So people on the other side of the issue would say, but if you build the natural gas transmission line, that's now infrastructure that you're going to have for 30 years.
Yeah, and I'm not denying that, but I think I'd rather take somebody that is an expert that does this for a living, that knows how an electron is generated and what it takes to generate an electron, its environmental attributes, and explain that to the group before we say we don't need natural gas.
So natural gas transmission, we should mention that your sector, the electricity sector, has reduced carbon by like almost 60% over 20 years, I believe.
Very proud of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Other sectors haven't. We're talking about transportation, for example. So as you, because you're going to be looking at all the sectors, right?
Yes.
So what comes to mind when you think of transportation?
Well, when you back up to what the bill's about, it's about electrifying our economy. And to do that, we need electric vehicles. We need to focus like a laser on the transportation sector. We've reduced carbon, as you said, 60%. We've reduced NOx 90%. We've reduced sulfur dioxide 88%. The electricity sector has done its part. However, we have 11 million cars in New York State. We need to get to an electric vehicle program that actually works. And we need to address buildings. Carbon emissions from buildings have increased another 5%.
Enormous.
So those are the areas that we really need to focus. I agree with Peter that was on transportation should be the #1 area that we look to first.
We have been speaking with Gavin Donahue, and he is the CEO and president of IPNY, the Independent Power Producers of New York. So maybe we'll talk to you again after the March 3rd meeting.
Sure.
Thank you.
Happy to do it. Thank you, Susan.
Ahead of the April 28th New York presidential primary, we've taken a look at some of the candidates' supporters and organizational structures upstate. Former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg's campaign has been a little quiet, but his volunteer base says support is growing, and one of those volunteers and a delegate for Buttigieg in the 26th Congressional District is Brian Ball, the president of Stonewall Democrats of Western New York. Now, Ball says as an LGBTQ leader in his community, it means a great deal to him to see the openly gay Buttigieg be a serious contender for the nomination.
For someone who's been involved in politics from an advocacy angle, coming at this strictly for LGBT issues for so many years, to see the type of progress that we've made in passing different legislation and how far we've come, it's sort of unbelievable to me that we've come this far where we have our own candidate for president who's serious.
Western New York political reporter Ryan Whalen spoke with Ball today and joins us now with more on Mayor Pete's upstate infrastructure. Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Susan, how are you?
Good. So this is the first time we've heard from a Buttigieg delegate.
It is, and like you said, they've been a little quiet, but they say support is growing. They were out petitioning in New York State. They have delegates in the 26th Congressional District. They don't have delegates in the 27th Congressional District, the other one in Erie County. They said they had a little difficulty with that, but they've been helping out with the campaign in other primary states, and they're getting ready for the April 28th primary in New York.
So, Ryan, who does the Democratic Committee support in Western New York? Do you know?
Yeah, so this is different than it was in 2016 when they were early supporters of Hillary Clinton,
well, of
among
course,
the first in the state. This time around, the chairman of the Democratic Committee said, we're going to let people choose. We're going to leave this open and see how it plays out. And it's really sort of spread out the support among candidates, where we've seen Erie County Executive Mark Poloncarz support Elizabeth Warren. We've seen many of the Buffalo for Bernie people who were doing that in 2016, again supporting Bernie. The chairman himself is supporting Biden, and we're seeing Brian Ball, who is a committee member for the Erie County Democratic Committee, going with Pete Buttigieg. So it's very spread out.
All right, so you've talked to a bunch of these delegates and seen their campaigns. Just how organized is Buttigieg's campaign compared to the others?
Yeah, I get the sense it's a little less organized here in upstate New York and Western New York, and that's why we haven't heard as much. But Ball says they're getting more and more volunteers daily. I think you can point to the fact that they don't have delegates in the 27th district, where you see delegates for Warren and you see delegates for Biden and Sanders in the 27th, which is a more Republican district, by the way, as an example. But they said that you're going to start hearing them get the word out.
We only have seconds, Ryan, but do the delegates think that this Mayor Pete can actually win in New York?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're thinking from the same way that the national campaign is, where it seems like Buttigieg maybe doesn't have as many passionate and vocal supporters on social media, but a lot of people working behind the scenes. And they think that he has a message that appeals to a lot of moderate Democrats, to a lot of people who will go out and vote, but maybe you're not hearing them on TV or on social media right now.
Ryan Whalen joining us from Buffalo. Thank you again. The wealth gap is not all that popular in New York, but pizza is. Morgan McKay will be joining us in a moment with a few slices and a very good story to tell. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. I'm Susan Arbetter. A couple of weeks ago, CBS This Morning used pumpkin pie to show the enormous wealth gap in the United States. Well, today, Morgan McKay joins us to talk about the wealth gap in New York State. And instead of pumpkin pie, she's going to be using cheese pizza because we're New Yorkers.
Of course.
How are you?
I'm good, Susan. How are you?
Good. So tell us more.
Well, we've got a great story to share to help distribute the wealth a little bit.
All right. So we basically are tossing to the package now. There is a rally that pops up almost every week at the Capitol, and let's listen.
It's a rally that pops up almost every week at the Capitol. All calling for the same thing.
And make sure that millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share so that everyone has a home to live in.
This wealth tax proposal is broken up into 3 different bills that would place an extra tax on the billionaires and ultra millionaires. Advocates say money from this tax could help pay for gaps in funding for education, healthcare, public housing, and more. A recent poll released by the Teachers Union showed that 92% of New York voters support new taxes on the ultra-wealthy.
92% support the fixed budget deficit.
So we took to the streets of Rochester and Syracuse to see if people think the wealthy are paying their fair share of taxes.
Probably not. Absolutely not. I feel like the tax code is really corrupt.
If you really wanted to gain revenue, it would be through the corporations. I don't think it would be that much on the super wealthy.
and if they would support taxing the wealthy.
I'm not sure that's the way to go. The last thing you want is to be labeled socialist.
To show how income wealth in New York is distributed, we're going to use pizza. So the top 1% of New Yorkers, this is about over 30% of New Yorkers are in the top 1%, and they had to make the bare minimum over $5,500, and this equals to about 2.5 out of an 8-cut pizza. 30% is about 2.5 slices. The rest of the 99%, they get all of the rest of the pizza, which is quite a bit. Now, this new income wealth tax bracket, this will only affect around 4% of New Yorkers, and this really is just a slice of cheese.
But Governor Andrew Cuomo has been staunchly against an increased wealth tax in New York, saying it would drive the millionaires and billionaires out of the state. And E.J. McMahon with the Empire Center agrees.
When you tax something excessively, you have less of it. So if you want to have less income to tax in the long run and fewer high-income people to tax, just keep raising their taxes.
I want some pizza, Morgan. That's all I have to say.
I tried to bring some up here. I'm sorry, Susan.
It's Mary Francis's fault. That's all the time we have for us. I hope that you're going to take a minute and let us know what you think. Drop us a line at feedback@capitaltonight.com. If you write to us, I promise that we will write back. On behalf of the entire crew here, I'm Susan Arbetter. Thank you for watching Capital Tonight, where you always have a seat at the table. Coming up, the acting director of ICE traveled to New York to speak out against the state's green light law. Nick Reisman spoke with him one-on-one. State GOP Chair Nick Langworthy had his own one-on-one with the president. He'll tell us all about it. Those non-disclosure agreements that Mike Bloomberg was criticized for last night during the debate, are they still legal in New York? Morgan Mackay takes a look, and we're going to fill you in on a big lawsuit around the same chemicals that contaminated Hoosick Falls. Capital Tonight starts now. It's Thursday, February 20th. Welcome to Capital Tonight. I'm Susan Arbetter. The acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement visited the Rensselaer County Jail today, and while there, criticized the law that allows undocumented immigrants to apply for driver's licenses. A visit included this at times noisy protest outside, but acting director Matthew Albence says the provision in the law preventing New York from sharing motor vehicle records with federal immigration enforcement is dangerous.
Cops on the street are not getting the information that they need to not only keep themselves safe, but keep the people they've sworn to protect safe. That's what this is about.
And no room for compromising with New York officials on this?
I don't know how you compromise about public safety.
Joining us now is our Nick Reisman. Nick, so this has led to this dispute whereby there's a freeze to the Trusted Traveler program. So no movement there.
Well, it certainly seems like there is no room for compromise on either side of this at this point. Down in New York City earlier in the day, Governor Cuomo reacted to the comments from the acting director of ICE and said essentially that the agency is on a jihad, his words, a political jihad,
which was
against
remarkable.
Undocumented immigrants. So it seems certainly that the rhetoric is ratcheting up on both sides of this.
Yeah, so what did Albence think about Cuomo's proposal, which was basically a compromise?
Well, as you just saw in that clip there, he rejected it out of hand. What the governor essentially wants to do here is allow access to the federal government, to the DMV database from New York on kind of this case-by-case basis for anybody who's applying under the Trusted Traveler program. And essentially, they could then see those records for the DMV. But that seems to have been rejected not just by ICE, but also by President Trump. The governor had that meeting with the president last week, and no resolution came out of it.
I thought that he was supposed to have another meeting with him this week. Did that not ever transpire?
It seems like the governor's phone has not been all that busy, at least when it comes from the White House on this, because you're seeing all these federal officials come in and start to really criticize the green light law.
So now Albence says that he would not, and ICE would not look at those DMV records of undocumented immigrants, but there's real fear out there.
Certainly from the undocumented immigrant community that there is a concern that the federal government would be able to gain access to those records and then target people who are living in the country illegally and deport them ultimately. So there is a serious concern there, and providing any sort of access to those records could ratchet up that concern.
Nick Reisman reporting for us. Thank you so much. New York State's Republican Party chairman Nick Langworthy was in Washington earlier this week, meeting in person with President Trump at the White House. Western New York political reporter Ryan Whalen caught up with him back in Buffalo today. In an exclusive one-on-one, they chat about the trip. Among the topics, the political stalemate over the green light law.
There's a lot of back and forth here. Did you talk about this with the president, and where are you at on everything with the green light?
Again, I won't speak about my private conversations with the president because those need to be remained private, but the governor is all politics all the time. The fact that he's withheld access to the DMV database from federal officials, all in the name of scoring cheap political points, I think shows his dedication to playing politics 24/7.
Ryan joins us now from Buffalo with more on what the GOP chair had to say about his meeting with the president. So, Ryan, it's not really a surprise, I think, that Langworthy is siding with Trump on green light.
Well, yeah, Langworthy is absolutely siding with Trump on green light. He says that the governor is essentially trying to make a two-tiered citizenship program in New York State, that state IDs are the window to citizenship, and that the governor is sort of backdoor trying to get people who are in the country illegally to have those rights. And he said that basically the governor thinks that there won't be consequences when he passes laws, that he's just playing to the left side of his base.
What else did they talk about?
Well, they talked, he wouldn't go into details of specifically what they talked about. He says that has to be between him and the president, but it's clear that they talked about the upcoming elections, particularly congressional races across the state. Obviously, the president is going to be focusing in on his own race in 2020, but Langworthy says holding the House and picking up or holding some seats in New York State is a priority.
So it was just after this meeting that the president endorsed Chris Jacobs in the open 27th. So did one have to do with the other?
Langworthy gave me kind of a non-answer answer there. He said they talked about a bunch of congressional races. And when he went into that, I asked him point blank, did you ask the president to endorse Chris Jacobs? He said, we certainly talked about that race, and that was on the minds of a lot of people that day.
Isn't it unusual, Ryan, that the head of a state GOP party has direct access to the president? I haven't seen this before.
Yeah, it's definitely different than what we saw with the last GOP chairman, Ed Cox, who was dealing more with state politics generally. We know that Langworthy had a relationship with Trump. He was part of that contingent that tried to get him to run for governor in 2014. He's been to the White House Christmas party a couple of times. He said this is the first time having a meeting specifically like this where they went and talked about politics and were one-on-one, so that was a little new.
Ryan Whalen reporting from Buffalo. Thank you again, Ryan.
He has gotten some number of women, dozens, who knows, to sign non-disclosure agreements, both for sexual harassment and for gender discrimination in the workplace.
None of them accused me of doing anything other than maybe they didn't like the joke I told. And let me put, there's agreements between two parties that wanted to keep it quiet, and that's up to them.
That's just a snippet for you of last night's debate. Former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg came under fire, especially from Senator Elizabeth Warren, as you saw there, for his use of non-disclosure agreements in both his work and campaign. A non-disclosure agreement, or NDA, is a legally binding contract, often between an employer and an employee, that doesn't allow either party to discuss the terms of a settlement or any of the allegations. New York recently just changed its laws surrounding the use of NDAs, and our Morgan Mackay joins us now. Now, Morgan, some of these changes just went into effect, didn't they?
Yes, exactly. The recent changes to non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, went into effect at the beginning of this year, and these really expanded on laws passed in 2018, specifically dealing with sexual harassment. So now if an employee is being sexually harassed and they want to bring forward a case, they have 21 days to decide if they want to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And if they do, they have 7 days to go back on this. So I spoke with a lawyer today who said this law is great for moving forward, and it could also provide an employee with extra benefits.
So we do have part of that interview right now.
Where it used to be by default that there would be a non-disclosure agreement,
Now I think the employee really carefully considers whether or not they want to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and if so, what's the value they want to put on that.
Bloomberg mentioned that his employees had the choice to sign these NDAs. Morgan, what problems could arise from being given a choice about whether to sign this?
Well, Susan, there's a concern that by allowing an employee the choice to sign an NDA, they might feel pressured still by their employer. So a lot of these cases, like sexual harassment cases, they're settled. So a lot of employees will have to choose between either going to court and paying a lot of law fines there, or having to get a hefty settlement and signing an NDA. So while this law does move quite a few steps forward, there could possibly be some loopholes still in this law.
Morgan McKay reporting for us. Thank you again, Morgan. A heated Democratic presidential debate last night. For the first time, former New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg was on the debate stage, and his performance was panned by political pundits around the country. He was attacked by the other candidates who seemed to try and paint him as an out-of-touch billionaire. Now, we asked you today on Twitter who benefited the most from Mayor Bloomberg's performance, and here's what some of you had to say. From Stop Lovely 2020, quote, Warren was the big winner, but Biden also navigated it pretty well and landed punches while avoiding getting hit. Biggest losers were the local officials who risked their credibility on a Bloomberg endorsement. According to Mikey Horse, the biggest beneficiary was, quote, Bernie by far, then Warren. If she stays away from those stories, she does very well. I think Bernie has the nomination and I'm not happy about it. Another user posted, clearly she who did the most to give Bloomberg a lousy night, e pluribus Warren. And finally, John wrote, Warren, who needs to stop being overlooked by the media. If you have something to say to us, just tag us on Twitter. Our Twitter tag is @CapitolTonight. You can also email me at feedback@capitaltonight.com. Still ahead on the show, Roger Stone sentenced to prison today. Jivan Vittal will be joining us live from Washington, D.C. with more on why a Western New York political strategist hopes to get Stone pardoned. Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. I'm Susan Arbetter. Roger Stone was sentenced to 40 months in prison for lying to Congress and witness intimidation. Western New York political strategist Michael Caputo, who is a friend of Roger Stone's, was at the sentencing and had this to say.
I think the president understands very deeply how Roger is in harm's way because of his support for Donald Trump. And now with this sentence, I don't think Roger should sit one day in jail, and the president should pardon him as soon as possible.
Our Jivan Vittal was in court today. Jivan, Michael Caputo clearly doesn't think Stone did anything wrong, and he recommended that the president immediately pardon Stone. Now, how likely is that?
So in the short term, it's unlikely because it's an election year, and the optics of something like that wouldn't sit very well with a lot of Republicans and even moderates who are really tough on law and order. But when it comes to the long-term implications of this, assuming there's a re-election somewhere in the mix, or even if an appeal is successful or unsuccessful, it is very, very possible. And judging by the president's comments earlier today, he's watching this one very closely, and he would like to see Roger Stone get off the hook.
Jivan Vittal reporting from Washington. I want to thank you so much for joining us again.
All right.
The U.S. Department of Defense has contracted with several companies around the country, including one in Albany County, to burn toxic firefighter foam that contains the same chemicals that contaminated the drinking water in Hoosick Falls. According to documents obtained via the Freedom of Information Act, the burning of PFAS chemicals has already taken place at Norlite in Cohoes and was never made public. Norlite sits next to a public housing complex. Today, environmental and community groups announced that they have sued the Department of Defense and the parent company of Norlite in federal court over their contracts to burn these chemicals. Specifically, the lawsuit claims that the DoD failed to comply with NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the National Defense Authorization Act. Joining me with more is former EPA Administrator and Sierra Club member Judith Enck. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Susan.
So, how was it discovered that Norlite had already burned these chemicals?
Well, thankfully, the National Sierra Club did a Freedom of Information request asking for data on where some of these PFAS chemicals may have been burned, and they were the ones who uncovered this information. They reached out to me. I looked at the documentation. We now know that 40 shipments of PFAS chemical went to Norlite between February of last year and September of last year. We know that Norlite burned some of this very toxic firefighter foam, and then some of it is still stored on site in Cohoes. I looked at the documents, I couldn't tell the quantities.
There are several regions around the country where this is happening. There's a couple of places in Arkansas, there's a place in Ohio, and then there's the place in Albany County, which is in Cohoes, Norlite. So what do we know about what happens when we burn PFAS chemicals?
Well, nothing good. What happens is the chemicals are not destroyed by incineration. They're not captured on the pollution controls on the stacks. These are slippery, and they're burning essentially powder.
So the scrubbers that are in the stacks that
do not capture
these pollutants.
And so these pollutants become airborne, and people living near the facility or downwind are at risk. This is a very serious issue. It's an environmental justice issue, and it's a lack of transparency.
My understanding is that these PFAS chemicals are used specifically because they don't burn. That's why they're being used in firefighter foam.
You're absolutely right.
So why is it then that they would try to burn these chemicals if they're not flammable?
Well, because the chemicals are so toxic, the Department of Defense has stopped using them in the firefighter foam. An important function. I'm not against putting out really hot fires. However, this toxic material is so toxic that the Department of Defense stopped using it. They stockpiled it, and they were holding onto it until they could figure out a responsible disposal method. And then when they thought people were not looking, they signed these multi-million-dollar contracts, sent it at this point to 4 incinerators in the country, 1 in Albany County.
Gotcha. So you are alleging that the Department of Defense didn't go through the proper administrative procedures and channels. Basically, NEPA, which is really an important foundational administrative tool.
Both the Department of Defense and the companies that did the burning, we maintain, violated the National Environmental Policy Act. If ever there was a process that needed an environmental impact statement, it's this. Not only did they violate the federal environmental law, they also didn't tell anyone.
So a couple of things. First of all, we got a statement from John McDonald. He's an assemblyman who represents Cohoes. In this statement, he says, there are many unknowns with this method of disposal, and I fully understand the importance of disposing of these potentially toxic substances safely. It's critical that we have answers before activity is permitted. Have other elected officials reached out to you, or have they made any statements to you?
The mayor of Cohoes, a new mayor, put out a very strong statement today. I think we'll hear from Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand at some point. They have been real champions about the need to not have the public exposed to these chemicals either in drinking water or in the air. Ironically, the New York State Legislature almost unanimously passed, and the governor signed a bill last session to prohibit the use of this particular chemical in firefighter foam. So that was really good to protect groundwater resources, soil. No one really expected that Norlite or any other incinerator in New York would start burning this, so it becomes airborne.
So federal lawsuit in court filed today. We have reached out to Norlite. They did not know about the lawsuit. I've also reached out to the parent company of Norlite, have yet to hear back. Judith Enck, who's a former EPA administrator and Sierra Club member, thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
The state's plastic bag ban takes effect in less than 2 weeks. Still to come on Capitol tonight, a professor who studies the impact of state policies on local governments says the ban could be so much better. Stay with us. Starting March 1st, New York's ban on single-use plastic bags will take effect. Just this week, the State Department of Environmental Conservation released its final regulations to govern the ban. Now, as you probably know, environmentalists are angry about the regulations because they allow for 10-millimeter plastic bags, which don't yet exist, but which will likely be manufactured soon. Now, my next guest is an expert on environmental sustainability at the local level. She's also a fellow at the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, and she says the new law could be a lot better. Dr. Mildred Warner is a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. She is also the maven of the plastic bag. Welcome to Capitol Tonight.
Thank you.
So I'm calling you a maven because last year you and a few other academics put out this research paper on the best way to ban plastic bags. What did you find?
Well, what we found from cities and states that had already put in plastic bag regulations, that what you need is a ban with a fee. A ban alone will not result in very much reduction because consumers and retailers will shift to alternatives, whether that's a thicker plastic or paper. And the goal here is to reduce our use of plastic bags, and a fee is a very effective way to do that. And so the cities and states that have the most success in reducing plastic bags have a fee as well.
Let's put the fee aside for a second. One of the reasons why you were looking into this is because of what happened in China and China not taking much more of our recycling. What happened and why is that a factor in this issue?
Okay, so we all think we're doing really well because we're recycling. But if you think about the waste pyramid, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to reduce, reuse, recycle, and then landfill just a little bit.
Okay.
And we have it exactly opposite. We landfill practically everything, we recycle some, we reuse very little, and we aren't doing enough on reduce. What happened when China decided to quit taking our recyclables is we hadn't developed good enough local markets here in the U.S. to absorb all those. And so it created a real crisis throughout the country for recyclers. Local governments and private industry are involved in recycling, and they didn't have a place to ship their goods. And so this caused people to really stop and say, you know, is recycling where we really want to be on the waste pyramid, or don't we want to move up and actually address the issues of reuse and reduction? And plastic bag bans fit in that frame.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to take now the fee off the table for a second. And you say that not only does there need to be a fee, but best practices suggest that the fee should be, you know, a few cents, maybe 10 cents, because that will be enough to sustain counties who actually have to do the heavy lifting on all of this.
So local government is responsible for your trash collection, and they may do that directly, or they may do that with a contract with a private entity, Waste Management, Republic Services, or some of the big private companies that handle this. But in any case, San Francisco determined that it cost them 17 cents per bag to manage the waste of plastic bags, because not only is it a waste management and recycling issue, plastic bags blow away.
Right.
And then they get into your storm sewers, they cause floods, ultimately they get into your water, degrade the water quality, and hurt marine life. So the cost of cleanup of plastic bags has been huge. Plastic bags are not free. They're very expensive, and they're especially expensive to those of us who are paying either in our taxes or our waste management fees for waste management.
So the regulations now allow for these 10-millimeter plastic bags. Dr. Warner, so what does that mean? What have you seen other communities do when that's been allowed?
Well, see, the problem is you'll get, some retailers will get with the program and say, hey, we're all for a 21st century approach to this problem, and let's reduce and let's move to reusable bags. Others will try to get around it by going with a thicker bag, which uses more resources, which maybe will reuse it a little bit more because, you know, sometimes you reuse a thicker bag more, but that's not what we're shooting for here. We're shooting for an actual reduction in use of bags. And so
a thicker bag is not going to be the answer.
No, a thicker bag could actually be worse because more energy, more resources will be used in its construction. It could be that it might blow away less because it'd be heavier, but you know, bags don't degrade.
No.
And this is the problem.
So one quick question, we only have seconds, but you have said that education is the key here for consumers. Why?
Because we have to change our practices. You and I are both old enough to remember the day when we didn't have plastic bags.
I remember all of the paper bags.
Exactly. You remember the paper bags, and then you remember back a little further when you carried a basket to the store, you brought your own bag. That's where we're going to end up in the 21st century, because we are recognizing that everything comes full circle, and we have to think about our ecological footprint. And so a change in consumer behavior, and our leading retailers are helping us lead the way. I mean, Wegmans has implemented the ban a month early because they realize that this is the way a responsible retailer works in the 21st century.
Dr. Mildred Warner of Cornell, thank you again.
Thank you.
This is literally a matter of life and death. Literally every day more kids are getting addicted, and this is a top priority.
It's hard not to ignore the growing popularity of vaping products. You've probably seen a lot of young people use those small e-cigarette products, maybe even your kids or their friends. But as you just heard there, it's something that Governor Cuomo says is a big health risk, and he wants it to stop. According to the governor, 27% of high school students are vaping, which is a massive increase between 2014 and 2018. Now he wants the state legislature to pass new, tough regulations on the industry. Already there's a federal ban on specific products. Cuomo says New York needs to go further in terms of what's included in the ban and regulate how these products are marketed. He says of flavored products mean more and more kids are getting addicted. That's all for now. I hope that you take a minute and let us know what you think of our show. Just drop us a line at feedback@capitaltonight.com. If you write to us, I promise that I'll write you back. On behalf of the entire crew here, I'm Susan Arbetter. Thank you for watching Capital Tonight, where you always have a seat at the table.